How many of you have waited and waited months for that very long anticipated appointment with your OB to finally review the labs that you've had done, only to walk into the appointment and walk out 5 minutes later to be told everything is normal and to just keep trying? Or to be told everything is normal, you need to see a fertility specialist for IVF. I understand how frustrating that is. I've been there for sure. And of course, it's part of why I do what I do. But there's so many emotions that come along with being told everything is normal. On one side, there's this relief because there's nothing blaringly wrong with you that is going to stand in your way from hopefully creating a child. But on the other hand, you're still not pregnant. And maybe you go months and months and months after this normal lab results to continue to not have your baby in your arms. And so it can be really frustrating to hear that everything is normal because you're still not pregnant. And then you feel like you hit the end of the road and you don't really know where to turn next. And you're being told your only option is IUI or IVF or fertility treatments, when you know deep down something isn't normal if you're still not pregnant. And don't ignore that feeling, because that little feeling inside of you is your instinct. It's the Lord speaking to you. Because here's the thing is, when we get labeled with unexplained infertility after having a basic workup, it's really just because we're only skimming the surface, and it's not really unexplained infertility at all. Typically, it's unexplored infertility. So in this episode today, we're going to dive deeper into what the traditional medicine workup typically looks like that I see day in and day out, compared to what a functional approach looks like. Because many times you see on the internet, take a functional approach, or somebody says, I did functional medicine, or this and that. But what does that really mean? And like, what is the difference? So we're going to dive into that. We're going to talk more about why your normal labs very well may be the silent saboteur to your fertility, and discuss ways to combat that. So if you've been praying over your normal lab results, you've been feeling a little uneasy, like things maybe aren't so normal at all, come along for the ride. We're going to dig deep into all of that and give you a better understanding of where your next steps are. Are your labs actually normal, or are they actually holding you back from the baby you've been praying for? God designed your body for fertility, but when the journey to parenthood feels like a heartbreaking mystery, it's so easy to feel lost. I'm Dr. Trisha, a nurse practitioner and fertility consultant who's been where you are. That's why I created Fertility by Design, where faith meets science to empower you with real solutions, holistic healing, and biblical encouragement. You are not alone. Your fertility is not broken. So let's walk this journey together. I have a client who spent like 5 really long years hearing the same phrase over and over. Everything looks normal. And it just wasn't getting her anywhere. She wasn't getting any answers. Her husband's semen analysis, she was told, also looked normal after years of them not even checking it. And there was just so much. She was so tired of hearing the word normal when she finally made it to me, that when we did a deeper, more functional workup, and we found some very, very staggering things: extreme gut dysbiosis, sky-high TPO antibodies, severe vitamin deficiencies happening. She almost thought I was making it up, because she had been so conditioned to hear that everything was normal. But here was the thing. What was being checked at each of these points in time throughout the 5 years was so minimal that it wasn't looking outside of the reproductive system at all. It was just skimming the surface when it comes to fertility health, because there's so many things outside of the reproductive system that affect the reproductive system. Our overall health, our thyroid, our gut health, our vitamin levels, our vitamin D, our thyroid, all these things really tie closely back to our fertility, but they're just not being explored. So for my client, when she heard this, it gave her a mix of course, hope. And, as we discussed, and she began to understand that all of these things were not separate problems, that they were all connected. And once we started moving the needle on one, we would definitely move the needle on the others. She started to have more hope. But initially, it was really hard, because for years and years and years, she had been told everything was normal. So she began wrestling with her faith, and all of this took a little bit of a spiritual toll. So thankfully, we were able to walk this all out together. And I can't tell you how many couples and women I've met that have been told everything is normal, but normal just does not mean optimal. When we see I hear a normal semen analysis, I always take that with a grain of salt because so many times it's not. And even now we know that a normal semen analysis parameters now would not have been considered normal many years ago. It would actually have been considered infertile. So the standards have changed because when we're looking at normal versus optimal, normal lab reference ranges are based on the general population. The general population these days, especially in America, is not healthy. They're struggling with so many underlying health conditions due to our environment, the food we eat, the standard American diet, the toxins we're exposed to, and all of those things, that those ranges are just so vast and wide. And oftentimes it is not a picture of optimal health. So while normal might be normal, it's not optimal for creating life. It's actually suboptimal for procreation. So like I said, when we're dealing with unexplained infertility based off of a few labs that have been checked, it's really unexplored infertility and likely not infertility at all, just subfertility is how I like to verb it, because when we say infertility, it makes it feel so permanent, but really often it's not. We're subfertile until we optimize our overall health, things that are contributing to inflammation in our body, things that are blocking procreation. Once we move the needle on those things, we see fertility thrive and we see pregnancy happen and healthy babies come to fruition because we've now optimized things from a standpoint versus going off of normal labs. It can be really dangerous to take normal lab values at face value because then we're getting pushed into these other treatments when our body is actually not ready to procreate. It actually has the ability to do it on its own. It just needs some shifts in some specific directions that we can see when we take back a few more layers and look below the iceberg and really get to the root of what is going on. So there is so much hope. If you're listening to this, there is so much hope for you. If you've been told you have normal labs, you just need to dive a little bit deeper. So let's talk about some of the testing that traditional medicine does versus what a functional approach looks like. So most OBs or reproductive endocrinologists are going to start with some of these staples. It's certainly not wrong. It's absolutely where we need to start, but it's often incomplete. So oftentimes they'll do a basic hormone panel. And the goal of this is to be like, you can go through your stuff. This is to empower you. So go through your labs and see if you've had some of these tests done. You might even be missing some of these pieces. So this is meant to really just empower you with information to be able to take to your provider to advocate for yourself. That is what the goal of all of this is. So typically a basic hormone panel, it's usually done on day 3 of the cycle or somewhere between day 2 and day 5. It's going to look like an FSH, an LH level, estradiol, AMH test, which you have to take with a grain of salt. I have another podcast that I was a guest on a podcast, and I'll link it in the show notes to why the AMH you should not put all your eggs in that basket, pun intended there. But there's so much more than the AMH that when you get that tested, oftentimes it's used almost as like a fertility death sentence or like a threat to get you to the next step. Unfortunately, not saying anybody's doing that purposefully, but it's just really overrated, that number, and it's really not a good indication of how likely you are to conceive naturally. So I go more into that in that podcast episode, so I will link that in the show notes. FSH and LH are going to help. LH, that's the luteinizing hormone that we measure as we're going to ovulate, but when we look at it on day 3, it can give us an insight of your cycle health. It can indicate potential signs of PCOS. FSH is going to speak a little bit more to egg quality. So those are really helpful. Estradiol we want to look at. So these are some of the more common ones that I see in traditional medicine. Then thyroid may or may not be checked. Oftentimes it's just a TSH, which does not show us the full picture of what is going on with the thyroid. Ultrasound is typical, and this is a good first step to look for any cysts or thyroids, assess the lining thickness. Oftentimes they'll do an antral follicle count if you're far enough along in the process. That is a much better indicator of your egg reserve. It's going to give us a better indicator of how you would respond to IVF if they were going to do that. So that is something that's typically checked, as well as an HSG. That's a very good test to have if you've been trying to conceive for 6 months and have not gotten pregnant, because that's going to make sure your tubes are open, your fallopian tubes. Can't get pregnant if the egg can't get through the fallopian tube and into the uterus. So that's a good first, check the box, make sure the eggs are getting through. That's an HSG test, as well as a semen analysis for your partner. That needs to be done right away, not a year, 2 years down the road. If you've been trying for 3 to 6 months with timed intercourse, you know you're ovulating, you know you're timing it correctly. It does not make sense to wait on a semen analysis, because you, as a female, or maybe your husband's listening to this too, great, listen up, does not make sense for the female partner to be doing all of this work to then ignore the other half of the equation. Takes two to tango. We know that there is so much that goes into the placental development, risks for preeclampsia, gestational diabetes come from the sperm. So we need to be paying attention to both pieces of the puzzle and addressing both sides. So semen analysis should definitely be done. If it hasn't, then you need to advocate for that. If all of those things in traditional medicine look normal, oftentimes you get labeled unexplained infertility, and you move on to maybe medicated cycles with Clomid or Letrozole, IUI, IVF. So typically, unexplained infertility is really diagnosed as all your labs are normal, your cycle is regular, we know ovulation is happening, but you've been trying for a year or more and you're still not pregnant. So what has been checked thus far, typically in this traditional medicine workup, is not really enough to go past the first layers of your fertility to even diagnose unexplained infertility, because there's so much still outside of the reproductive system that affects the reproductive system. Suboptimal semen analysis, thyroid issues like TPO antibodies being present, inflammation from the gut that's affecting egg quality, sperm quality, estrogen levels, progesterone production, things that affect implantation, cervical fluid quality. There's so many things on a deeper level that need to be assessed before we slap on a diagnosis of unexplained infertility, because it leaves you feeling like there's nothing you can do. And in reality, that's not the case. So when it comes to taking more of a functional approach, we really start to peel back a lot more layers and see how is your body functioning from a cellular level, what could be causing issues at the root that is then trickling into affecting your fertility. So here's some of the things that in functional medicine that we like to look at. First one being gut health. Doing stool testing to look for dysbiosis, which is just an imbalance of the microbes, so that there's inflammation happening, gut lining breakdown. One leads into the next, which leads into the next. If there's pathogens in there, do you have yeast overgrowth? What does your digestive markers look like? Are you reabsorbing toxic estrogens? It can give us so much insight, because any gut issues is going to equal inflammation, which is going to equal hormone disruption and poor nutrient absorption, which are all things we need to prioritize procreation. We will typically, in a functional approach, look at micronutrients and mineral status. So looking at B vitamins, vitamin D, iron stores, magnesium, zinc, things like that. We're going to look at those nutrients that are going to really impact egg quality, sperm quality, ovulation, quality of ovulation, and that hormone signaling, as well as implantation. We also typically look at inflammatory markers like your HSCRP, homocysteine, because when those are elevated, they can prevent implantation as well as cause early losses. Looking at a full thyroid panel. So you've probably heard people say, well, you need a full thyroid panel. Well, what does that even mean? A full thyroid panel is not just your TSH. It's going to look at your free T3, your free T4, your reverse T3, and your TPO antibodies, thyroglobulin antibodies, which typically are elevated in more of an autoimmune picture. I see it a lot with gut dysbiosis leading to issues with the thyroid. And we can talk more about that in another podcast episode where we talk about the thyroid and the gut connection. But just know that looking at these things, research shows us you can have a normal TSH level and still have TPO antibodies present and still can negatively affect fertility, even with a normal TSH level. research is there to support that. We need to look at the full picture of the thyroid to know, is everything functioning the way that it's supposed to? Are we seeing things off? TSH is going to be like that tip of the iceberg and everything else is underneath, right? We're only going to see what's happening up here once all these things are really out of whack enough for it to reach the tip of the iceberg. So for instance, a lot of times women are told that their TSH is fine when it's about 4.2. Research supports when you're trying to conceive, it should ideally be below 2.5 during preconception and conception. But because it falls in that normal range, 0.5 to 5, a lot of times it's being overlooked as a concern when in reality it's far from optimal, and we need to figure out why the thyroid is not functioning optimally, because it's so important for all the other factors that go into fertility and maintaining a pregnancy. Other things that we can look at are progesterone. We can look at DHEA. We can look at prolactin. We can look at sex hormone binding globulin. These give us a more detailed picture of what is going on with the hormones out past just the typical ones that are checked. A full day 3 hormone panel looks like estradiol, FSH-LH, prolactin, DHEAS, free and total testosterone, that sex hormone binding globulin, and then progesterone. We want to look at 7 days past ovulation. A lot of times this is also tested. You may have heard day 21. Well, that's great if you ovulate on day 14, but if you don't, then we're missing it at its prime, which is typically 7 days past ovulation. So those are typically what we're doing in a more functional setting, diving even deeper, pulling back more layers on the hormones and getting a good look there. There's also things like the Dutch test or salivary cortisol testing that are gonna be looked at more commonly in functional medicine, because we know the adrenals play an important role. We know stress is rampant in American society, or in just in a culture globally right now. And that hustle and drive culture is driving everyone's cortisol levels through the roof. Your cortisol is high, your progesterone is probably low, and that is going to impede implantation and issues with thickening of the uterine lining. So it all really is tied together. And so we're taking a more comprehensive approach. Blood sugar and insulin resistance is another factor that we look at in functional medicine a little bit deeper than typical traditional medicine does. Looking at your fasting glucose, your fasting insulin levels, and maybe even your A1C. Even if you're not diabetic, of course, we're going to see in that fasting insulin level, insulin resistance, long before we would see it reflected in your fasting glucose or your A1C. So it gives us quicker and earlier insight into whether you're dealing with insulin resistance, which we know is going to be a silent fertility blocker and contribute to things like PCOS and really make it more difficult to get pregnant. So you can see the difference between traditional medicine and functional medicine and how it goes deeper and peels back more layers in a functional standpoint. I take it a step further and integrate faith, because you can't do any of this without God, in my opinion. And if you're trying to, it's going to be harder. But when you are going through all of this, it's not to try to hyper control everything from a functional standpoint. And it may seem like that at first. And some people are hesitant as that, and they want to trust what they're being told here. But then they're also, you get to this crossroads where you're being told fertility treatments are your only option, but that doesn't really feel like the right next option for you. But then you see this other side of things where it's functional medicine and you're not sure about that either. And so hopefully this brought you some clarity. And from my perspective, the whole purpose is for us to have the data from a science-backed perspective and then take that and pair it with our faith. So we're taking action with tools that God has given us to heal our bodies. We're putting our overall health as the priority and being good stewards of our bodies the way God has called us, pulling the baby from the pedestal, putting God here, the tools that God has given us to heal, utilizing those so that our body can then prioritize procreation the way God intended, and you get what you've been praying for because you're using the tools God has given you to heal the things that this culture and this world have just thrown off over time. and it's not your fault. A lot of things we've inherited from, poor gut microbiomes from our parents, and it just trickles down. Poor advice from the media on how to eat and how to fuel our bodies. And so we just spend a lot of time in functional medicine reversing a lot of those preconceived notions and healing our body with the tools God has given us. So if this conversation, hopefully it has blessed you, if it struck a chord and you're feeling that gentle nudge in your spirit to look a little bit deeper, here's what I want you to do next. Go ahead and join our free Fertility by Design Facebook group. We're going to do lots of mini masterclasses over there. We're doing one later this month on the cycle. I'd love to see you join that group, and I can't wait to welcome you with open arms. Subscribe to our Trying to Conceive Tuesday email list. Lots of information, recipes, encouragement, all kinds of things hitting your inbox every single week. And if you are really feeling like you want to explore the next steps in your fertility journey, book a complimentary call with us. If you are looking to do a functional fertility workup and you want to see if working with us is your right next step, go ahead and book a free call. That link is in our show notes as well. We are so glad that you joined us here. Hopefully this episode has you feeling super empowered, ready to take on your fertility journey head on, let go of what you can't control and step into what you can and really steward your body well. So if this episode has blessed you, share with a friend, let me know, give us a review. We would love to hear from you. I can't wait to hang out with you all next week on Fertility by Design. That's it for today's episode of Fertility by Design. Subscribe so you never miss an episode, leave a review to help more couples find hope, and share this with a friend who needs encouragement on their fertility journey. Need even more support? Let's connect. Find me on Instagram at Trisha Zehrung for faith-filled fertility guidance, real solutions, and a community that just understands. Remember, your fertility is not broken. Your body is beautifully and wonderfully designed, and God's plan is always perfect. I'll see you next time.